Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know how much we love bringing you insightful reads, and today we're all about Jenny Jarvis's Lead with Confidence, a practical guide for women.
And let me tell you, it's not your typical leadership book. This one's really special. It's like she gets the unique challenges women face when it comes to leadership.
So it's like a super practical guide, right, for women who are like, okay, I want to step up and lead, but I need like a roadmap, something real and actionable.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing I really appreciated was how Jarvis tackles this whole idea that there's this doubt floating around about women's leadership potential. Like she addresses it head on.
That's super interesting. So she's not just saying, hey, here's how to be a leader. She's actually saying, hey, let's break down these barriers that are holding women back from leadership in the first place.
You got it. It's like she's acknowledging that there's this whole other layer of stuff that women have to deal with, and she's not shying away from it.
Love that. So tell me, what are some of the key takeaways that listeners can expect? Is it like rah-rah motivation, or is it more about like concrete advice?
Oh, it's definitely concrete advice. Jarvis is all about giving you the tools to actually put these concepts into practice. And one of the first things she dives into is leadership styles.
Leadership styles. Okay, so is she saying there's one right way to be a leader?
No, not at all. In fact, she kind of flips that idea on its head. She actually encourages readers to figure out their own authentic leadership style, like what works for them.
So it's not about trying to fit into some predefined mold.
Right, because that can totally backfire. She actually talks about how trying to be someone you're not can hurt your leadership in the long run.
That makes a lot of sense. So how does she help you like figure out what your style is?
She has this whole section with questions and scenarios that help you think about your strengths, how you naturally react in different situations, what you're good at. It's actually really insightful.
Okay, I'm already intrigued. So you figured out your leadership style. What's next?
Well, she doesn't just leave you hanging there. She gives you a ton of practical advice for actually being a leader.
Like what? Give me an example.
For example, she has this whole section on how to prep for your first day as a leader, like super specific stuff from researching your team, getting to know the company culture, and even managing what she calls your leadership physicality.
Leadership physicality, what's that?
It's about how you present yourself, basically. Your body language, your tone of voice, even how you dress. Jarvis says these things can really make a difference in how people perceive you as a leader.
I can see that, especially when you're new to a leadership role. You want to project confidence, right?
Absolutely. And she also gives you these really insightful questions to ask your team members when you first meet them, like ways to go beyond the typical small talk and really get to know them.
Okay, spill the beans. What kind of questions?
Well, she suggests asking things like, what are you most proud of accomplishing in this role? Or what's one thing you wish you could change about your job? Stuff that gets people thinking and opens up a real dialogue.
Wow, those are some seriously good questions. It shows you're genuinely interested in them and their perspectives.
Exactly. It's all about making those connections early on. And then she dives into the tougher stuff, like how to handle those challenging conversations that every leader inevitably faces.
Yeah, nobody likes conflict, but it's part of the territory, right? So how does Jarvis approach that?
She's really big on staying calm and assertive, communicating clearly, and she even gives you scripts for these tough conversations, which is super helpful.
Scripts, really? That's amazing. Like, what do I say when?
Yeah. And she doesn't just focus on the words. She talks about your tone, your body language, even when to pause for effect.
Okay, this is starting to sound like a must-read.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I have to ask about something that I think a lot of us struggle with, especially as women in leadership. Imposter syndrome. Does she talk about that at all?
Oh, absolutely. She dedicates a whole chapter to it, and it's one of the most relatable parts of the book. What's really cool is that Jarvis actually shares her own experiences with imposter syndrome.
No way. She gets real about it.
Totally. And she's super honest about how it's affected her throughout her career.
I think that's so important because it makes you feel like, hey, if she can overcome it, maybe I can too.
Exactly. It makes the advice feel so much more authentic. And she gives you these practical strategies for reframing negative thoughts, focusing on your accomplishments, and building a support system.
That's super helpful. And I know we're just scratching the surface here. We haven't even touched on things like negotiation skills, building a network, all that good stuff.
I know, right? There's so much more to uncover. But we'll dive into all of that in the next part of our deep dive. So stay tuned for more insights from Lead with Confidence. All right, so, we talked about finding your leadership style and kind of owning that, right? But what about when you're leading other women, specifically?
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting because I feel like that dynamic isn't talked about enough? What does Jarvis have to say about that?
Well, she makes this point that historically there haven't been a ton of opportunities for women to manage other women simply because there weren't as many women in leadership positions to begin with.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
So it's kind of like we're navigating this new territory, and it probably comes with its own set of, challenges and opportunities.
exactly. And one thing Jarvis highlights is that women leaders often have this deeper understanding of the need for flexibility, like especially when it comes to things like childcare or family responsibilities.
Right, because we've lived it, right.
Yeah.
So there's that shared experience and empathy.
Yeah, for sure. But she also doesn't shy away from the potential downsides. Like sometimes there can be these unspoken, maybe even unfair expectations placed on women leaders by other women.
Ooh, that's a good point.
Yeah,
It's like we can be our own worst critics sometimes, holding each other to these crazy standards.
totally. And she even touches on the idea that sometimes women can be, well, less supportive of each other in the workplace than men might be in similar situations. It's definitely a complex dynamic.
It makes you think about all the pressures and expectations we internalize, right? So I'm guessing she talks about managing men too.
Oh, yeah, she definitely does. And it all comes back to recognizing that everyone's different, you know? Regardless of gender, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to managing people.
Okay, so adapt and be flexible.
Got it.
But speaking of challenges, let's talk about leading a brand new initiative. I remember my first time being put in charge of a big project. I was totally freaking out. Does Jarvis offer any guidance on that?
Oh, she totally does. She breaks it down step by step, like she's right there with you.
Yeah.
And she acknowledges that sometimes you're starting from scratch, which can be exciting. But other times you're inheriting someone else's mess, which is, well, not so exciting.
Ugh, tell me about it. Trying to figure out what's been done, what needs to be done, who's supposed to be doing what. It can be a nightmare.
She gives you all these smart questions to ask yourself and your team to help you gain clarity and get everyone on the same page. And she even introduces this framework called the RCI model. Have you heard of
What's
that?
the RICI model? No, what's that?
It stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. It's basically a way to map out everyone's roles and responsibilities for each step of the project, so there's no confusion later on.
Okay, that sounds super helpful. I can definitely see how that would prevent a lot of headaches down the road.
Right. And she also reminds you that your leadership style might need to shift, depending on the project and the people involved. Sometimes you need to be more collaborative, other times you need to be more directive. It all depends.
It's like going back to those different leadership styles we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Knowing when to use which one is key. But what about those high-stakes meetings, like presented to the board or senior stakeholders? I still get butterflies just thinking about it.
Oh, I totally get it. Those can be nerve-wracking. But Jarvis has some really solid advice on how to prepare, how to present with confidence, and even how to handle those curveball questions that always seem to pop up.
Curveball questions, you mean like the ones that make you want to disappear?
Exactly. But she gives you strategies for staying calm, thinking on your feet, and even using those questions to your advantage. It's all about being prepared.
That would have been so helpful back when I was starting out. Okay, so she covers internal meetings, but what about those external relationships, like those strategic partnerships that can make or break a company?
She's got a whole section on that, too. It's not just about signing a contract. It's about really nurturing those relationships, making sure they're mutually beneficial.
Because a bad partnership can be like a toxic relationship, right? It just drains your energy and resources.
100%. Jarvis really emphasizes the importance of choosing the right partners, building strong communication, and regularly evaluating those partnerships to make sure they're still aligned with your goals.
It's like spring cleaning for your business relationships. Out with the toxic ones, in with the ones that actually support you.
I love that analogy, and she even provides this visual tool called a stakeholder map to help you prioritize those key relationships and figure out where you need to focus your energy.
Okay, so we've covered managing different personalities, leading new initiatives, building strategic partnerships. I'm starting to feel like I could run a Fortune 500 company after listening to all this.
That's the spirit. But before you go off and conquer the corporate world, there's one more essential element of leadership that Jarvis delves into that we need to talk about.
Oh, what's that?
The art of conversation. It might seem basic, but she argues that it's actually a much more powerful tool than we often realize.
Wait, conversation. Isn't that just, talking? We do that all the time.
True, but Jarvis takes it to a whole other level. She talks about how conversation isn't just about exchanging information, it's about building relationships, understanding different perspectives, and even influencing outcomes.
Okay, I'm starting to see where she's going with this. It's about using conversation strategically to achieve your leadership goals.
Exactly. And she gives you practical tips on things like active listening, asking insightful questions, and even using your voice and body language to project confidence and authority.
So it's about being intentional with your words, your tone, your nonverbal cues. It's like conversation is a secret leadership weapon.
I love that. And she doesn't shy away from those tougher conversational scenarios like handling objections, dealing with difficult people, or even those who just constantly disagree with you.
Oh man, those dissenters can be tricky. Any favorite tips from the book on how to handle them?
One that really stuck with me was trying to understand their perspective, really listening to their concerns, and even maybe turning them into advocates for your cause.
Wow, that's a really interesting way to look at it. Instead of seeing them as the enemy, you see them as potential allies.
Exactly. And she emphasizes that diversity of thought can actually lead to better solutions, more innovative ideas, if you can learn to harness those different perspectives.
Okay, this is all starting to sound really fascinating. I'm adding lead with confidence
Okay.
to my must-read list for sure.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what other areas does Jarvis cover?
Well, there's this whole section on managing your own manager, which I wish I had known about earlier in my career. And she also dives into essential leadership skills like delegation, giving feedback, and even managing your own energy and well-being.
Ooh, managing your energy and well-being. That's a whole other level of leadership I hadn't even considered.
Right. It's about recognizing that you can't pour from an empty cup. Jarvis is big on self-care, setting boundaries, making sure you're taking care of yourself so you can show up as your best self for your team.
Okay, that's a really important message and one that I think a lot of us need to hear more often. So, ready to dive into the final part of our deep dive with Lead with Confidence.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Lead with Confidence. And there's one thing I've been thinking about. It's managing up. We've all had those bosses, right? The ones that make you wonder how they even got there.
Oh, yeah, I've had my fair share of those learning experiences. But the cool thing is, Jarvis has this whole chapter on it, and she calls it Managing Your Manager, which I gotta admit sounds kind of weird at first.
Yeah, isn't the manager supposed to be managing you? Like, how do you manage up?
Well, Jarvis sees it as a two-way street. It's not just about them telling you what to do, it's about you taking ownership of the relationship, communicating your needs, setting boundaries, making sure you're both on the same page about how you like to work.
Okay, so it's more collaborative than like, trying to manipulate your boss or something.
Exactly. And she gives these really practical tips, like being super prepared for your meetings with your manager, not just showing up and winging it, but actually having an agenda, things you want to discuss, being clear about what you need from them.
So like treating those meetings as seriously as you would any other important meeting.
Yep. And she also says don't be afraid to speak up if something isn't working for you. If your manager's communication style is driving you nuts or their expectations are unclear, address it.
That can be tough though, right? Especially if you have a manager who's intimidating or not very receptive to feedback.
True, but she gives you some scripts for how to approach those conversations constructively, even with the toughest bosses.
Okay, good to know. I might need to bookmark that chapter for future reference. So besides managing up, what other essential leadership skills does Jarvis talk about?
Oh, tons. Delegation, giving feedback, resolving conflict. But one she really emphasizes is negotiation.
Negotiation. That word just makes me cringe. I always feel so awkward when it comes to negotiating anything, whether it's my salary, a project deadline, or even just getting my point across in a meeting.
I used to feel the same way, but Jarvis has this really cool way of reframing negotiation. She sees it as a collaborative process, not a battle.
Okay, that already sounds less scary.
Right, and she gives you this framework for approaching negotiations strategically. The goal is to find a win-win solution for everyone involved.
Win-win is definitely better than win-lose or even worse, lose-lose. But how do you actually get there?
She talks about being prepared, knowing your worth, not being afraid to ask for what you deserve, but also active listening, understanding the other person's perspective, finding creative solutions that meet everyone's needs.
So it's like problem solving together instead of just trying to get your way.
Exactly. And she even gives you scripts for those moments when things start to get tense or emotional.
Scripts for negotiation.
Mm,
Wow, she really does think of everything.
he does. And another key skill she covers is decision making, which, as a leader, you're doing constantly.
Yeah, that's a big one. So how does she approach decision making?
Well, she says there are different approaches, and it really depends on the situation.
Hmm.
Sometimes you need to make a quick call on your own. Other times, it's better to get input from your team or even involve people outside your immediate circle.
So it's about knowing when to be decisive and when to be collaborative.
Yep. And she gives you this framework for figuring out which approach is best for each situation. It's like having a decision-making toolkit.
I love that. A decision-making toolkit. Okay,
Mhm.
so you mentioned cultural intelligence earlier, or CQ. Is that something Jarvis addresses too?
She does. And she makes a really strong case for why it's so important for leaders, especially in today's world, which is so global and diverse.
Because it's not enough to just be good at what you do anymore. You have to be able to work with people from different backgrounds, with different communication styles, different ways of thinking.
Exactly. A culturally intelligent leader can adapt their style and approach to be more effective in those cross-cultural interactions.
So it's like another tool in your leadership toolkit: cultural awareness, sensitivity.
Right. And she gives you practical tips for developing your CQ, like learning about different cultures, being curious about other people's perspectives, even stepping outside your comfort zone.
It's about embracing diversity as a strength, not a weakness.
100%. And before we wrap up, there's one more thing I want to mention. It's the chapter on team reflection and assessment.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about individual leadership. It's about helping your team grow and evolve together.
Exactly. And she gives you all these cool tools for helping your team evaluate its performance, figure out what's working, what could be better, how to work together more effectively.
Like what kind of tools?
She talks about regular team check-ins where you can discuss what's going well, what could be improved, how you can support each other. She also suggests team building exercises and even planning those off-site meetings or away days to help your team bond and strategize.
Those offsite meetings can be so great for getting everyone out of the office and focused on the big picture.
Totally. And she's all about making those meetings engaging and interactive, not just another boring meeting where everyone's checking their emails.
Because who needs another PowerPoint presentation, right?
Right. And she even gives you a framework for designing those offsites to make sure they're productive and achieve their goals.
Wow, she really has thought of everything.
Yeah,
It's like she's anticipated every challenge a leader might face and given you a solution or a strategy for dealing with it.
she really has. And finally, she ends the book with this powerful chapter addressed to managers, urging them to be more intentional about supporting the women they lead.
I love that she brings it full circle.
Yeah.
It's like she's saying, hey, creating a more inclusive and equitable leadership landscape is everyone's responsibility.
It really is. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in fostering the next generation of confident female leaders.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, if you're ready to step up and lead with confidence, I highly recommend checking out Lead with Confidence. It's a game changer.
It really is. It's packed with practical advice, inspiring stories, and it'll give you the tools and confidence to achieve your leadership goals.
Absolutely. So that's it for our deep dive into Lead with Confidence. We hope you found it insightful and inspiring.
And remember, leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about embracing your unique strengths, learning from your experiences, and constantly striving to be better.
Beautifully said. Until next time, keep leading with confidence and keep diving deep.